Hello, my name is Kobi or Ocean Ayensuo, and it is an honour to be part of the Queer Poetics Research Group project in this way. As an artist, as a poet, as a musician, as a multidisciplinary artist, I have worked within archive for a number of years now, and I'm really proud of the different projects and different ways that I've really experimented, played and spoken into the gaps of archives over the years. At the moment I am published in a number of anthologies and collections, namely The Runaways, London anthology with Spread the Word and Ink, Sweat and Tears. Have a collection of poems there. This book spoke specifically to the fact that there is not enough almost research or attention to the fact that black and brown people were enslaved within London as well, and often the enslaved people would seek out their freedom. They would run away, and there would only be a slight, a newspaper cutting calling for their auction, for their return. That would be the only proof of their existence. And so as poets, as creatives, as researchers in many ways too, we went in, we researched, we picked the stories that really resonated and that we felt that we could speak into those silences in those archives the most, and we told their stories through flooding humanity back into their stories. I'm also published in Simon Newman's Freedom Seekers, which is linked to the project. He was one of the researchers who helped us gather the research for the project. My poem, Escape Route, is also present at the beginning of this anthology. And then of course, last but not least, Articulations for Keeping the Light In. This is a Barbican Young Poet anthology, and in this poem, one of my mightier world building poems, the poem The Year of Return, which uses moments within Ghana's political history, timestamps and personal history, as well as surrealism, to explore my queerness, my relationship with my matriarch, and the almost inability to completely fit myself into the mold of the matriarch as a black, queer and trans person. But I've done so many different projects within the archive, namely the most recent one. I'm always working within the archive, but most recent huge project was my project to Washington DC in January, where I worked within the African American Museum at the Smithsonian Museum, and I was the first kind of researcher and artist to touch the archive of Jimmy Daniels, who was a black cabaret singer, black gay cabaret singer within the Harlem Renaissance, and my job was to kind of flood life into his story, to look through his possessions and to tell his story, to make a multidisciplinary, musical, poetic, theatre-y show. That was my calling that I felt pulled to kind of make, and I had a residency when I got back to London where I debuted this work for the first time. I guess my work with archive is very, very extensive, but I think today specifically something that I wanted to talk about was ways that we as queer people, as black POC and queer people can access the archive and can speak to the silences of the archive, because often archives are very, rooted within white supremacy in many ways. Who is telling these stories? What is our sources to access archives? The ways that we see archives, what counts as an archive? Who are telling the stories? Where do we get our information? Does the language that is being used to describe our histories as POC queer people, as black people, does this language serve the best, is it the best possible way for us to understand what is going on here? Is there more to the story? And often, as the people who know our histories well, or from the lineage of these people, often we can be more equipped than we know to speak to the silences of the archive, whether that's through speculative fiction or gathering different resources and speaking into the gaps that aren't present. And that's something I teach a lot in different workshops that I do. So I often do a workshop that's kind of along the lines of reimagining and reclaiming the archives, but I have loads of different versions of this workshop. And in these workshops, I speak a lot about different ways into the archive. So when I think about different ways that we can access the archive, I think about different tools that we can use as creatives to explore and speak into the gaps and flood humanity back into these archives if they are often whitewashed. So if we are writing for a character, or we're writing for a timeline, or we're writing for a group of people, how might we flood colour back in? We might do that through language, indigenous languages, native languages, refusal to translate. That is a deep interrupting. That is a deep, cementing of a culture, of who we are as people. We might use timestamps. We might use and interweave political history as well as personal history. We might write questions to the people in question that we're trying to represent, especially if we don't have the answers. What questions might we ask the archive? Do those questions show up in our writing in itself, or are the questions that we write down that might help us to speculate better, that might help us to write up our speculative fiction or our speculative poetry? These are all tools that we might use. And also, when I'm thinking about the project that I did in Washington, D.C., I was recommended a book by the wonderful Kobi Ayensuo. It was Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, and looking to that book to see how Saidiya Hartman, for example, spoke and described all of these gender fluid people, as well as women, as well as men, like all these different genders, and told their stories. Saidiya Hartman used a combination, again, of archival materials such as police reports, accounts, anecdotes, different elements of the archives, but then from there was able, because of the identity and also all of the information that she had gathered, was able to then speculate, to speak into the silences. And this is something that I'm really, really interested in as a person, and something that I know that we all can have the audacity to do, especially when we relate to these experiences. Surrealism is also a really important tool. When I think about surrealism, I don't just mean whimsy or fantastical. I think that these are really important tools as well. What is possible? What do we play with? What language and what questions can we ask when we play with what is possible and is not possible? I also think about ancestral wisdom, indigenous spiritualities, and what practice we can have with our ancestors, what wisdoms, what downloads, what messages we can have when we think about communication with ancestors, with a spiritual team. All of these things that aren't often conversations that we might think about when it comes to archive. And on that note, this is a very important topic that I think that I really wanted to focus on in this conversation. And the reason I wanted to focus so much on loads of different forms of accessing the archive, specifically now honing in a little bit more on spirituality and the surreal, the spirituality and indigenous wisdoms specifically, is because this is something that I really stumbled across when I was first really curious about archive, not just as a practice, but also as a source of affirmation for my queer and trans identity. I grew up hearing a lot that queerness was an un-African thing. And when I dug deeper, when I was doing my first kind of archival involving project, which was my play in 2022, Sankofa Before the Whitewash, it was there when I was looking for proof of queerness pre-colonially that I stumbled very beautifully into spirituality, that I stumbled beautifully into the affirmation that is present when we look back into our histories. Yes, we are proof enough that queerness is always okay because we as queer people exist. And then when we look back into our ancestry, we see that there is a long, long line of us, and therefore it is our right to stand even firmer, knowing that we are thousands of queer ancestors strong, you know. Specifically, what was really, really beautiful was coming to understand the presence of queer monarchs who weren't really celebrated for their queerness, but are very celebrated within their countries presently, such as Njola Nzinga, who was a gender fluid monarch within now what is Angola, so pre-colonial Angola. Santewa, who was referred to as Oba Berima, which translates quite literally to woman man. I know for a fact that from doing research that Njola Nzinga, for example, had a gender fluid harem of people and subjects that were present and supporting her. And often these figures led the siege against, the fight against colonial rule, and so are celebrated for all of these, but are not celebrated for their queerness, for their gender fluidness, for their beautiful, beautiful multiplicity. And what was also really, really beautiful was not just understanding that queerness had always existed within pre-colonial Pan-Africa, but also the fact that there was a beautiful, deep, 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 deep interlinking with queerness and with indigenous spiritualities. Because oftentimes, queer people could embody multiple different energies, had space to hold all these multiple energies within their soma, within their being, because it already was present. And often they were able to merge with different spirits and deities and convene with the higher powers and indigenous practices. And so when we think about this, and we think about the demonization of indigenous spiritualities that we see so much today, where there was a deep, after colonization, there was very much a huge takeover where Christianity became the order of the day, and a lot of within now a lot of African countries, a lot of Christianity is very much present and is very much the popular religion. But within that, there has been a demonization of indigenous wisdoms. And we also see, side by side, a demonization of queerness, a criminalization of queerness. And when we look closely, and you see that queerness and spirituality were so interlinked, you then see that the demonization of both is also interlinked. And for me then, by looking to our histories as queer people to see our ancestry, and when stumbling then so beautifully and richly into spirituality, we then see that queerness is also a site of divinity. This is a fact when we look back in time, because queer people were often the spiritual leaders. So when we look back in time, not only do we find affirmation, but we also find that we were the tenders, the safeguarders, the leaders within spirituality, within channeling the divine. And so I see both history and our archives and our looking back. My heritage is Ghanaian, and Sankofa is a bird that looks back on itself, bends their neck back to look back on itself, and it means to look back and to look to see what your ancestors taught you. So when we look back, we find that we were always sacred. As someone who is as someone who is a spiritual human being, as someone who is reviving Ghanaian indigenous spirituality, and this was also through my archival practice, someone who identifies as a clairaudient person who has an altar and a practice with my ancestors, who is able to divine within the spirit realm as well, who is also clairaudient, it is essential to me that this is also spoken about, this journey to like destigmatize deeply, but also just show the beauty of indigenous wisdom and indigenous spiritualities, because this is where we remember our divinity as queer people, our affirmation that we have always been here, we have always been divine, and there is proof of that no matter how far you look back, and it's also here now. And so yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit more about that, and this is my offering to the Queer Poetics Research Group.